The subjective experience of being human feels unified and continuous. Consciousness appears as a single stream in which thoughts, perceptions, and intentions seem to belong to one stable observer. This sense of unity feels immediate and unquestioned, as if awareness itself were indivisible. From the inside, the mind does not present itself as a collection of parts, but as a single, coherent presence. In daily life, we experience ourselves as a single agent, directing thought and action. Decisions feel intentional, as though they originate from a central point of control. Language reinforces this assumption by framing behavior in terms of choosing, believing, and wanting. The experience of agency therefore feels direct, even though the underlying processes that generate action remain inaccessible to awareness. Neuroanatomy presents a different picture from subjective experience. The human brain is divided into two hemispheres, each containing its own sensory, motor, and cognitive systems. These hemispheres operate in parallel and exhibit functional specialization. This biological division raises a fundamental question. If cognition is distributed, why does experience feel singular? The apparent unity of experience depends on a large structure called the corpus callosum. This dense bundle of nerve fibers connects the left and right hemispheres, enabling rapid information exchange. Through this connection, perception and action are integrated across both sides of the brain. Unified awareness, therefore, relies on communication rather than structural simplicity. In an intact brain, this communication is so efficient that the division between hemispheres remains hidden. Information processed on one side becomes immediately available to the other. As a result, perception, language, and behavior appear internally consistent. Consciousness presents a finished outcome rather than revealing the coordination that produced it. When the corpus callosum is surgically severed, this integration breaks down. Each hemisphere continues to function, but information can no longer be shared between them. Awareness does not disappear, but access becomes divided. This condition exposes the fact that unity is maintained, not guaranteed, by neural communication. The split brain condition provides a unique scientific window into the structure of the mind. It shows that what feels like a single self can emerge from multiple independent processes. Unity appears to be a constructed outcome of coordination rather than a fundamental property. This insight sets the foundation for re-examining agency, identity, and conscious experience itself. The brain operates using a principle known as contralateral control. Each hemisphere primarily processes sensory input and motor output from the opposite side of the body and visual field. This organization is not arbitrary, but a fundamental feature of neural wiring established early in development. As a result, perception and action are distributed across the two hemispheres in a highly structured manner. Visual information illustrates this division clearly. Stimuli presented in the right visual field are transmitted exclusively to the left hemisphere. Likewise, stimuli appearing in the left visual field are routed only to the right hemisphere. Under normal conditions, this separation goes unnoticed because the information is rapidly shared across hemispheres. In a healthy brain, the corpus callosum allows visual information to be integrated almost instantly. What one hemisphere sees becomes available to the other without conscious effort. This exchange enables unified perception, coordinated movement, and consistent reporting of experience. The system functions as though perception were centralized, even though it is initially processed in separate locations. In split brain patients, this integration no longer occurs. Visual input remains confined to the hemisphere that first receives it. Information presented to one side of the brain cannot be accessed by the other through normal channels. As a result, perception becomes functionally isolated rather than globally available. The left hemisphere typically contains neural circuits responsible for language production. It is specialized for speech, labeling, and verbal explanation. When visual information reaches only the right hemisphere, the left hemisphere has no direct knowledge of it. This creates a gap between perception and verbal report. The right hemisphere, however, still perceives the stimulus accurately. It can recognize shapes, objects, and spatial relationships without difficulty. What it lacks is the linguistic machinery required to describe what it knows. Knowledge exists without words, remaining inaccessible to conscious verbal expression. This dissociation reveals a critical feature of cognition. Awareness is not synonymous with language, and perception does not require verbal access to be real. Information can guide behavior even when it cannot be articulated. The mind therefore contains multiple representational systems that do not always converge into a single reportable experience. The implications of hemispheric disconnection were revealed through controlled experiments conducted by Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga. These studies were designed to isolate information to one hemisphere at a time, allowing researchers to observe how each side processes stimuli independently. By carefully managing visual input and motor responses, they exposed cognitive operations that normally remain hidden by interhemispheric integration. In one classic experimental setup, an object is briefly presented in the left visual field. Because of contralateral wiring, this information is received only by the right hemisphere. When the participant is asked to name the object verbally, no correct response is produced. From the standpoint of speech, the object effectively does not exist. Despite the lack of verbal recognition, the right hemisphere clearly identifies the stimulus. When asked to respond using the left hand, which is controlled by the right hemisphere, the participant can select or draw the object accurately. Perception is intact, even though it cannot be translated into language. This demonstrates that recognition and naming are separable processes. This situation produces a striking dissociation between what can be reported and what can be done. Verbal behavior suggests ignorance, while motor behavior reveals understanding. Two parallel forms of knowledge coexist, each expressed through a different output channel. The mind no longer presents a single unified account of what is known. These findings suggest the presence of multiple streams of cognitive processing operating simultaneously. One stream is analytical, linguistic, and oriented toward explanation. The other is spatial, perceptual, and silent. Both contribute to behavior, but only one typically gains access to speech and conscious report. Importantly, the individual does not experience these streams as conflicting. There is no immediate sense of internal contradiction or division. Each hemisphere operates according to its own information without awareness of the other's limitations. This reveals how easily the brain can maintain a sense of coherence despite fragmented access. The split brain experiments therefore challenge the assumption that consciousness reflects total cognitive activity. What we can say about our experience depends on which neural systems have access to language and reporting. Awareness, in this sense, is constrained by communication rather than defined by perception itself. The mind knows more than it can explain. The left hemisphere contains a specialized function often described as the interpreter mechanism. Its role is to generate coherent explanations for behavior, perceptions, and internal states. Rather than accessing full causal information, it constructs narratives that make actions appear intentional and consistent. This process operates automatically and without conscious awareness. When behavior is initiated by neural activity outside the left hemisphere, the interpreter still attempts to explain it. If the right hemisphere triggers an action, the left hemisphere invents a plausible reason after the fact. This explanation feels genuine to the individual, even though it does not reflect the true cause. The brain prioritizes coherence over accuracy. This narrative construction does not involve deliberate deception. The interpreter works with limited information and fills gaps using inference. Its primary function is to preserve a stable sense of self and agency. As long as behavior can be explained logically, the system remains satisfied. Perception itself follows a similar principle. The brain does not passively record reality, but actively constructs it. Sensory input is incomplete and fragmented, yet experience feels continuous and meaningful. Interpretation bridges missing information to create a usable internal model of the world. Attention further shapes this constructed experience. Only a small portion of neural processing reaches conscious awareness. The brain selects what to highlight while suppressing competing signals. This selection reinforces the illusion of a single controlling perspective. In split-brain conditions, the interpreter continues to function despite reduced access to information. It explains actions initiated by the right hemisphere without recognizing the source. The resulting narrative feels internally consistent even when it is factually incorrect. This reveals how perception and explanation are tightly coupled. These observations demonstrate that continuity of experience is manufactured rather than discovered. The brain actively maintains a coherent story about itself and the world. Even when biological disconnection exists, the mind produces unity at the level of awareness. What we experience as reality is therefore shaped by interpretation as much as by sensation. The mechanisms revealed in split-brain research are not limited to clinical cases. Healthy brains rely on the same principles of interpretation and integration. Actions are often initiated by neural processes before conscious awareness forms an explanation. The sense of deliberate control emerges after behavior has already begun. Everyday decision-making frequently occurs outside of awareness. Subconscious evaluations guide attention, movement, and choice before reasoning becomes involved. Conscious thought then provides a narrative that makes the outcome appear intentional. This sequence feels natural, even though it reverses the assumed order of cause and awareness. The experience of a central executive may therefore be misleading. Rather than directing all activity, consciousness monitors and interprets the results of distributed processing. Multiple neural systems compete for influence over behavior at any given moment. The one that gains expression becomes incorporated into the story of self. Attention functions as a limited resource rather than a command center. It highlights certain signals while ignoring others. This selective spotlight creates the impression that a single perspective is guiding action. In reality, attention reflects the outcome of competition among neural processes. The unified self is best understood as a retrospective construction. It is assembled from fragments of perception, memory, and action after they occur. Consciousness narrates these fragments into a coherent sequence that feels continuous. The story appears central, even though it is assembled after the fact. Internal monologue represents only a small portion of cognitive activity. Many operations that shape behavior remain silent and inaccessible to language. What we hear in our thoughts is not the mind itself, but a filtered summary. This limitation reinforces the illusion that thinking equals knowing. Recognizing these processes alters how everyday experience is interpreted. Behavior becomes less about conscious command and more about coordination among systems. Awareness plays a role in integration and reflection, not in absolute control. The self emerges as an explanation rather than a source. The findings from split-brain research challenge the idea of a singular and indivisible self. If awareness can be divided by altering neural communication, then unity cannot be assumed as a fundamental property. Instead, it appears to be dependent on biological conditions. identity begins to look less like a fixed essence and more like an emergent pattern. Neuroscience suggests that the mind is composed of multiple interacting processes. Each contributes a specific function, such as perception, language, emotion, or action selection. No single process holds complete authority. What we experience as selfhood arises from their coordination rather than from a central core. When the physical connection between hemispheres is removed, the modular nature of cognition becomes visible. Processes that normally cooperate are forced to operate independently. Awareness continues, but its scope is altered in ways that are not immediately obvious to introspection. This reveals the limits of subjective insight. The absence of perceived division in split-brain patients is particularly revealing. Even when awareness is functionally separated, the individual does not report feeling fragmented. This suggests that the feeling of unity is not a reliable indicator of underlying structure. Experience reflects integration at the level of report, not at the level of processing. Unity, therefore, functions like a user interface. It simplifies complex biological activity into a coherent experience. This simplification supports effective interaction with the environment, but conceals internal complexity. The brain favors usability over accuracy in self-representation. Biological architecture defines the boundaries of conscious experience. What can be known, reported, or integrated depends on neural connectivity. Changes in structure lead to changes in awareness without requiring any metaphysical explanation. The self is shaped by the brain that constructs it. From this perspective, consciousness resembles a chorus rather than a solo voice. Multiple neural events contribute simultaneously, even if only one narrative is heard. What feels like a single point of awareness is the outcome of selective integration. The mind is many processes speaking as one. Understanding the split-brain phenomenon reshapes how human agency is interpreted. Behavior no longer appears to originate from a single controlling center. Instead, it emerges from coordination among distributed neural systems. Responsibility and intention must therefore be understood within a biological framework rather than an intuitive one. This perspective shifts attention away from metaphysical explanations of mind. The sense of self does not require a separate non-physical entity to function. Unity arises from communication within a biological network. When that communication weakens, the experience of a singular self also weakens. Conscious unity is best described as an emergent property. It arises when specialized brain regions exchange information effectively. No single region contains the self in isolation. The self exists only as long as coordination is maintained. When interregional communication fails, coherence dissolves. Perception, action, and explanation can fall out of alignment. The experience of agency becomes less reliable as an indicator of causation. What feels intentional may not reflect the true origin of behavior. These insights require a more careful interpretation of human behavior. Actions should not be evaluated solely through conscious explanation. Neural processes operating outside awareness play a decisive role. Understanding behavior, therefore, demands humility about the limits of introspection. Recognizing the gap between action and explanation changes how responsibility is framed. Conscious narratives describe outcomes rather than initiate them. This does not eliminate meaning, but it places it in context. Awareness interprets, integrates, and reflects rather than commands. True self-awareness begins with acknowledging these mechanisms. The feeling of unity is not an error, but a construction. Understanding how it is built allows a clearer relationship with thought, action, and identity. The illusion becomes informative once it is recognized as such.